Hi everyone, it's Amity. Welcome back to another video. It is December, and in December I love doing recaps of what happened in the year and especially what we did like on stream and all of that sort of thing. So I am going to continue a trend that I started last year where we go through and we rank on a tier list every single game we played on stream during that year. I will go ahead and link last year's video in the cards as well as in the description, since some of today's games are going to be compared to last year's rankings, but I'll let you guys know when that's the case. I'll also go ahead and link my playlist of my monthly video game reviews. Is also something that we do at the end of every month. We go through the games I played that month and I talk a little bit about them and give them some rankings as well. And this is basically just compiling all those thoughts into one single video. Real quick before we jump in, I feel like I do have to mention this is, of course, just my opinion. This is completely subjective of how I played these games. Your opinion may differ, and if anything, I would love to hear your opinion on some of these games. If you agree with my thoughts, if you disagree with them, where you would put them on the list, please feel free to let me know down in the comments. And of course, if you would like to watch me play through any of these games, the VODs are in a playlist on my channel. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our rankings. So the lowest I rated any game in 2024 was a 3 out of 10. So we're going from 3 all the way up to a 10 out of 10. So first here we have the BioShock series. We played through BioShock 1, 2, and Infinite at the very start of the year. This trilogy is such an amazing trilogy of games. I'm yet to play through the DLCs for, I believe it's BioShock 2 and Infinite. That's definitely something I want to go back and do at some point. But for now, we're just going to be ranking the base games. BioShock 1 got a very strong 8 out of 10 from me. I really enjoyed playing this game. Without spoiling anything, the twist at the end had me shook. The story was so great, the characters were good, the combat was really fun and well thought out, very complex. The thing that knocks it down to an 8 for me is I made the mistake at the start of the game of picking normal difficulty. I had the intention going into this to start on easy because I had heard how difficult this game could be, but at the last second I changed my mind to normal, and that was a terrible mistake. Within the first half hour of the game, we died about 30 times to like one of the first Rosie fights, and I ended up having to restart and change the difficulty down to easy. And after that, I don't think we died at all, but that just first half an hour experience did kind of sour it for me a tad, but I really enjoyed the game. Next is BioShock 2. This one may be controversial, but I actually prefer it to the first game. I loved BioShock 2. I'm not sure out of the two which one I actually prefer the story in. That's a really close call to me, but the thing that puts BioShock 2 above the first game for me is the combat. In BioShock 2, you actually get to play as a Big Daddy, and the power fantasy you get from walking around with that drill hand is so fun. So that's really what took it up a rank for me. And next is BioShock Infinite, which is just below the other two at a 7 out of 10. Now, BioShock Infinite, I know some people really love to hate. I really enjoyed the game. The story, I don't think is anywhere near the other two, personally. And there were times I got a tad lost. My brain doesn't always think in terms of verticality when it comes to exploration and platforming, but that was fairly easy to come over. But the game was just so fun. I caught myself having a really good time with the combat and the gameplay of this game. And again, no spoilers, but the very end of the game once again had me literally slack-jawed. It was kind of incredible. By no means is this me calling Infinite a bad game by putting it below the other two. It ranks below them simply because it did feel quite different to the other two BioShock games. It definitely went in its own direction a little bit, but it is still such a fun game. Next, we have the final couple Dead Space games. We played 1 and 2 back in 2023. Dead Space 2, I had ranked a 7 out of 10. Dead Space 3 goes down another peg for me to 6 out of 10. This is, again, I know a game people really love to hate, and I definitely understand the criticisms behind it. No one loves a paid DLC, especially when it quite literally locks the true ending of the game behind a paywall, but playing it so far into the future after its release, that wasn't a problem for me. I understand the dislike between the co-op orientated campaign as well, but I played the game single player, so again, I didn't really have to deal with that. And the crafting and weapon customization system, some people love, some people hate. I didn't mind it. I don't think I would have gotten through this game were I not able to craft healing items and ammo. The weapon customization system I just didn't really use. It was a little bit complex for me. And the positives of this game, I think it actually looks fantastic. I even played it on the Xbox 360 and it looked incredible. The necromorph designs were so disgusting and gross and they were awesome. Cons, however, it definitely did take away from that horror atmosphere. I spoke a little bit more about it in my Dead Space ranking video of all of the games together, which I will go ahead and put in the cards here as well. But it is just so much more action orientated than the first few games. Like the first hour of gameplay alone, I think you survived like 2 separate plane crashes. The first 5 minutes, your tutorial is you getting thrown into a fight. It's absolutely insane. Your first boss fight is like an hour in. But what really bothered me about this game is, one, the climbing sections, those like rock climbing sections were so annoying. They happened way too much. They went for way too long. And they were just so freaking finicky to try and control. It honestly felt like just trial and error at times whether Isaac was actually going to jump where I wanted him to jump or not. And I died so many times in these sections because of that. And then the backtracking near the end as well, which I don't have a problem with backtracking in games. But the final like 2 hours of this game, I think I was literally in the same like 2 rooms, just going back and forth doing basically fetch quests. And so this game could have easily been trimmed down like 2 or 3 hours, and I think it would have been better for it. I also had a glitch in the final boss that made me have to restart a checkpoint, which was not ideal. I still enjoyed my time with this game. I think if you do like Dead Space, and you do like action shooters especially, that it is a fun one. The rest of the game was actually quite enjoyable to play through, but yeah, it definitely does not hold up to the other Dead Space games for me. Now, Dead Space Extraction was actually a bit of a shocking wild card for us, all the way up to an 8 out of 10, basically with the original Dead Space, I think. Now, Extraction, for anyone who is unfamiliar, which I totally wouldn't blame you, this game is not spoken about much. It is a spin-off slash prequel game. It actually shows you firsthand how the outbreak on the Ishimura begun. You play as one of the workers who helped transport the marker off of Aegis 7 onto the Ishimura, which is so cool to do, but it's actually an on-rails shooter, so in the vein of like House of the Dead or Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles. It was released on the Wii and the PS3. We played the PS3 version, so we just used an analog controller, which was actually better than you'd expect. I had no problems with the sensitivity or trying to aim where I needed to. It actually went really smoothly. But this was just such a fun game. It was pretty quick as well. It was maybe like 6 hours long, but it's just really fun, especially if you love like the Dead Space universe and you want to get a little bit of insight on how everything began. It's super fun. And if you can pick this one up, I highly recommend it. It's also pretty cheap by the looks of it. Next is one we actually just finished playing for our Retrovember event in November, and that is Dino Crisis. This guy's a 6 out of 10. And again, that's not to say I disliked the game, but I do find myself comparing it quite heavily to the Resident Evil series, since it is also made by Capcom. It came out the same year as Resident Evil 3. Very similar gameplay style, you know, your survival horror, tank controls, fixed camera angles. But instead of zombies, you have dinosaurs, and instead of a bioweapons government conspiracy, you have a time travel government conspiracy. Now, this game was really good. I did definitely enjoy my time with it, but oh my god, it is difficult. I don't think I would have even gotten a third of the way through this game were it not for walkthroughs and guides. I got lost a lot. I was really struggling to wrap my head around the map system. It tells you what room you're in, but there's no sense of orientation, so you don't know like which door's which way you're facing. which is not necessarily a problem of the game. I know the Resident Evil games don't really do that either, or at least back in the PS1 days they didn't. I think that may have just been because we had just come off the back of Silent Hill, and that game does have a really intuitive map system. But this game was very difficult. The puzzles as well are really, really hard, and between that and getting lost, I definitely needed a guide. I do like that there's multiple endings you can get, and there's multiple paths and choices you can follow between the different characters. That I really enjoy. I like Regina as a character. The dinosaurs are also definitely a lot more threatening than zombies. They are very fast and they hit very hard, so I felt a lot more in danger than I do in a Resident Evil game. My other complaint is, I don't know whether this was a me problem or if it's the game. We were using a PS1 disc playing from a PS3, but the audio was mixed really quiet. There's no option for subtitles in the menu, so I had to play without them. But 90% of the time in the cutscenes, the music's like here, the voices are down here. I could not hear what they were saying, so I don't know if that's maybe just a PS3 problem or if that's just the way the game is mixed, but I missed out on a lot of context because of that. So very fun. I would love to play the second game at one point if I can ever get my hands on it, but it doesn't hold up to Resident Evil for me. Next, we are going to do the Kill Monday game, so Fran Bow and Little Miss Fortune. I did get to play both of them this year, and Fran Bow was one I'd actually had sitting in my Steam library for many, many years. I watched, I think it was like Daz Games or someone way back in the day play it, and I just never got around to it. But Fran Bow for me is a 7 out of 10. It's a side-scrolling point-and-click horror game, which is super interesting. I don't think I've ever really actually played a point-and-click game, but the puzzles were really fun. I only had to look up like a small handful of them. For the most part, I could work them out myself, which was nice. And the story is so good. Mega trigger warnings. This game is super, super dark. There are a lot of very, very heavy topics on show that they do not shy away from. They can be quite confronting how they're depicted, but I love the story of it. I think it was such a fun game. If you are okay with a lot of the topic material and you want a different style of horror game, I definitely recommend it. Little Miss Fortune, for me, I also really enjoyed, but it is slightly under Fran Bow for me, and that's mainly just down to its length. Little Miss Fortune, again, side-scrolling point and click, but it's a bit more focused on exploration, just like clicking on everything and seeing what happens rather than it is actually puzzles. But again, awesome story. I also love that the creators tied it in a little bit to the Fran Bow story as well. It's not a direct sequel, but you can tell they definitely take place in the same universe, which I think is really cool. Lots of fun Easter eggs that I really liked, and the story in this one is also, again, absolutely incredible. I loved the ending. It absolutely threw me for a loop. I was not expecting that. But it's really short. We finished this game in a single stream. It was like 3 hours long. So I would have loved for it to be a bit longer, but the humor, the story, everything is super fun. We also played Fear 3 this year. We finished the last of the Fear series because there's no DLC for this one that I know of. And this one was also quite a controversial opinion. I ranked it an 8 out of 10 right alongside the first game. To me, I think Fear 1 does the horror better. I think it does the story better, but Fear 3 was just so fun. I honestly didn't hate the story as much as a lot of people do. I mean, it's a psychic child birthing like super warriors. It's gonna get a little weird, but the gameplay was so fun. I didn't really get stuck in this game, which was wonderful. The difficulty felt very nice and balanced. There were a lot of fun mech sections, which we love. And honestly, it was just so much fun. I really enjoyed myself with this game, and I think people sometimes just need to take it for what it is. It may not have been the best Fear game. It definitely strayed away from the other two, but it's a great game nonetheless. All right, let's take a look at the 4 Dark Pictures games next. I finally got around to playing all 4 of the Dark Pictures games. These are made by the same people who did Until Dawn and The Quarry, which we had both played previously on the channel. And these actually so conveniently get ranked basically in terms of release order. Man of Medan for me is the lowest at a 6 out of 10. Of course, still a great game. The reason it ranks so low for me is because it's very short. This game took me about 4 hours. Super, super quick. And I think that they were still very much fleshing out what they wanted these games to be. Each of them is supposed to be kind of based around a different occult. This one was more so just like a ghost ship. I think it being like set in a boat and out on the ocean is really cool. But if I can speak on the story a little bit, I felt more threatened by the humans that kidnapped us than I did by the fact that there's ghosties on the ship. I think it definitely needed some work in that account, but I still had a good time with it. This is definitely one, though, that I can see being more fun with a friend. I've also done a ranking video on all of the current supermassive games, so the Dark Pictures games, and including Until Dawn in the Quarry. So if you want to watch that, I'll link that in the cards here as well if you want to hear a bit more of my thoughts on this entire franchise. Next is Little Hope, which goes 1 rank up into a 7 out of 10. This one is based on like witchcraft and the Salem witch trials, which I was really excited for. I think that's a super cool concept. I liked the switching back and forth between like present day and the past day. I thought that was super fun. I liked the characters and their dynamic, and this one, out of all the Dark Pictures games, I think has the best like twist in the story. This has a super fantastic ending. One thing I didn't like very much about this game though is it actually uses the personality traits for most of these games. The relationships and personalities you give your characters doesn't really do much other than change dialogue options, but in this one it actually locks endings from you. And so we ended up losing a couple characters because of that, which I was just a tad salty about. And one up again from there into an 8 out of 10 is House of Ashes, which is the third game. This one I think had my favorite gameplay out of the 4. I love the vampire design in this one. They are not Twilightified. They are very much utterly terrifying. I also like the dynamic between the characters. They're military guys who are literally currently in a war, and you have some people from both sides that get stuck together, and you gotta like decide if you want to work together or still try and fight each other while you're trying to get out of this underground nest of vampires. So the story is great, the character's great, and this, out of all 4 of the Dark Pictures games for me, had the most intense combat, I guess you could call it. I was so on edge, like, all the time. It really just felt like you could not get a break. It was fight after fight after fight. And then last is The Devil in Me, which actually got an 8.5 out of 10, so just slightly above House of Ashes. I didn't get as invested in the characters in this one, but I think out of the 4 Dark Pictures games, this had my favorite story. You play as a group of like film students who film documentaries about like murder mysteries and things, and you've been invited to see the recreation of H.H. Holmes' murder house, the first American serial killer. So not necessarily an occult, but still something a bit sinister. But as it turns out, the guy is not just a super big fan and wanted to recreate the murder house, he actually wants to be like Mr. Holmes and has trapped them in the house jigsaw style, and they have to solve traps and puzzles along the way to get out. And some of the choices in this one actually felt difficult. At times, there really did not seem like there was an obvious answer on what was right and what was wrong, and it felt like they held a lot of depth. Genuinely, decisions you make like right at the start can still affect you all the way to the end, and I love that about these games. So this one I think is like peak Dark Pictures anthology right here. Next is In Sound Mind, which is a bit of a wild card game. It released a few years ago and seemed to be kind of under the radar. No one was really talking about it, but the few people who I did hear play it said it was actually a really good psychological horror. So I wanted to give it a shot, but sadly I did not enjoy it as much as I thought I would, so I ended up putting it at a 6. The story is really cool. You are a psychologist, and basically all 4 of the patients you've been seeing have kind of and it's coming back to haunt you, and you're basically stuck in like a gulag situation, and you have to trace back through what happened with these patients, what was wrong with them, and what you could have done better to help them before the same fate becomes of you. The puzzles were pretty nice. My complaint with this game is that it was difficult. I got lost quite a bit. I needed a guide for many points during this game. It's fairly linear, all things considered, but sometimes it just wasn't super obvious what you had to do or where it wanted you to go. The first chapter of the game I think is still my favorite, and it had my favorite boss fight. Each chapter after that I think went downhill a little bit, but it came up to a nice wrap up at the end. I enjoyed the ending. Yeah, I really don't have a whole lot to say about this game, honestly. It is super cheap, so if you want to give it a shot, it is very easy to. I picked it up brand new on the PS5 for $10. And it's fairly short. It's like 6 to 8 hours long, I would say. It took me a little bit longer because I kept dying. But I like how the chapters are broken up. I like the sort of like hub area at the apartment building you have to keep coming back to and using the things you unlocked in the chapter to explore further. I really like that. I just feel like it started slacking as the chapters went on. Next is Kirby 64. It feels like it's been so long since we've played a Kirby game. We played this quite a few months ago now. And back in 2023, I had said that Kirby Superstar was my favorite Kirby game. I think we rated that like an 8 or a 9. But Kirby 64 shoots right up to a 9 out of 10 for me. At no point did this game feel very difficult, which I love because I'm garbage at platformers. The art style was so freaking cute. It was like watercolored and everything is so like cartoony and chibi. It's adorable. And the music is so sweet and the levels are actually really fun. There's a bunch of variety in this game as well. You've got like some 2D, some 3D sections. You can combine your power-ups now, so there's a lot more customizability in that aspect. It was just such a good game. I really enjoyed it. Next, we have the Luigi's Mansion games. I played number 2 and number 3 this year, and they actually both sit the same for me at a 6 out of 10. So we'll talk about Luigi's Mansion 3 first, since that's actually the first one I played. I really liked it, but my complaints were its difficulty, which is kind of embarrassing to say considering this is like a kid's game. But I actually found it really challenging in some bits. The final boss battle literally had me raging like it was Dark Souls. This was insane. And I definitely got stuck in some of the puzzles. I needed help with some of them. There's just so many mechanics going on. It feels like literally every button on the controller is mapped to a function. So coming up to a puzzle, it was like, which of my 6 different abilities do I use to solve this? And it was a little difficult. Versus Luigi's Mansion 2, I'm ranking the same because I enjoyed the combat more. I don't know what it was, but it felt a lot more fluid. It felt really punchy and satisfying to actually capture these ghosts. And I don't think the puzzles were as hard. I think I do agree with people when they say that Luigi's Mansion 2 is the slightly easier version of them. There's just not as much going on. But what brings it from a 7 back down to a 6 is its checkpointing system. In Luigi's Mansion 3, the coins you suck up you can use to buy things at the shop, and some of these items are revive bones, which means if you die, you revive immediately rather than having to restart from a checkpoint. And you can have like up to 5 of these at a time. I always had at least 5 on me because I just had so much money. Whereas in Luigi's Mansion 2, that shop isn't a thing. It was originally released on the 3DS. It uses more of an episodic mission-based style than it does versus Luigi's Mansion 3, where you just have one area broken up into checkpoints. So with Luigi's Mansion 2, there is one bone you can find in each level, and if you miss it, you don't get a bone, basically. But because it's like mission-based, there's no checkpoints. So if you die and you don't have a revive bone on you, you didn't happen to find it, you restart from the start. Which thankfully only happened to me once or twice because, again, I did find this game a lot easier. But losing like an hour's worth of progress after a death, especially if you were super close to the end of the level, is so frustrating. Madison! Oh, Madison. This one I ranked a 7 out of 10. I think if I could go back and change it, I would probably bump it down to a 6, but we are going by what I ranked them originally, and that is a 7. This one is a puzzle horror game, and I did like the story. I liked the setting. I again enjoy that hub style where it's all in the same house. You just, after each like objective, unlock something new to explore a little bit further in the house and solve that puzzle you've been trying to solve for like an hour. But again, puzzles, man, difficult. I'm starting to think this is a me problem and that I'm just maybe not very good at puzzles in video games. But some of these were hard. We again had to look up a walkthrough quite a few times. Getting near the end, once you sort of have everything unlocked, it's a little bit more obvious, but there were moments in like the start and the middle of the game where I just honestly did not know what it wanted from me or where I was supposed to go next. I do also think that the camera mechanic's cool, having to take photos of things to kind of change the environment, but I really feel like I didn't have to actually use it that much. I would have liked if they implemented that a little bit more. But definitely scary. There were quite a few jump scares in this game that actually really got me, which I love because I don't get genuinely scared very often, so I enjoy when it happens. Next, it looks like we have our little stint of Pokemon here. So we're going to start with Pokemon Stadium 2. I ranked the original Pokemon Stadium a 6 out of 10, and Stadium 2 is going to sit there right there with it. I did prefer Stadium 2 a tad more. I think I actually gave it a 6.5. I liked the mini games in it. I thought they were really fun, and I liked the sort of academy section you can go to as well, where you have to fight and beat certain trainers by using specific tactics and strategies in battle. I think that's really fun. It made me battle in ways I normally wouldn't, which I really liked. But again, it was just difficult, man. These games did not mess around. And now not only do you have the one gym tower to complete, you have two. One for Kanto, one for Johto. The Johto tower especially kicked my butt. This game was rough. I genuinely don't know if the AI is smart or dumb in this game, because we had a point where the AI would just constantly switch their Pokemon out. I'm talking every single turn. There were times where for just like 10 turns straight, every move they made would just be a switch, and it was super annoying. On the other hand though, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX for the Nintendo Switch, what a name, is a 9 out of 10, baby. This is fun as hell. I had never played a Mystery Dungeon game before. I gave this one a shot a few years ago, back when it released for like 30 minutes, and I just never got into it, but I gave it another shot, and I am so glad that I did. This one is so fun. It has the charm of a regular Pokemon game, but a little bit more strategy when it comes to the dungeons. All the dungeons are randomly generated each time you go into them, and they're turn-based, so your opponent can't move unless you move, but that means if you want to move or do something, they get to move as well. So it adds a little bit of strategy in. You can also only take like so many items in with you at a time, and if you lose in a dungeon, you lose everything that you have on you, so the stakes are high. But this game was adorable. I loved the characters. I loved getting to be a Pokemon. That was so fun. And the art style is so pretty. It's like this hand-drawn watercolor artwork. It's so beautiful. And the story is actually quite well done for a Pokemon game, as silly and childish as it is to be a Pokemon living in a Pokemon world. The story actually got pretty intense there at times. The only thing stopping this from being a 10 out of 10 Pokemon game for me is that you can't evolve your Pokemon until you've finished the main story. It's like a post-game thing, and I didn't love that. I really wanted to evolve some of my Pokemon, and then finding out I just couldn't until I finished the game. I think that would have been really cool if I could have gone into like the final dungeon to fight Rayquaza with more than just a Bulbasaur. And lastly for Pokemon, we have Pokemon Colosseum, which we also just finished this November, and I gave it a 7 out of 10. Colosseum I really enjoyed. Immediate bonus points for your starter Pokemon being an Umbreon and an Espeon. I literally got to start with my favorite Pokemon of all time, which was incredible. The battles were also really fun. The story was actually pretty cool. I really liked this game. I like the whole shadow Pokemon thing. I did actually enjoy that. I didn't end up getting to the post game because in order to do the post game, you need to have caught like all 30 something shadow Pokemon in the game and purified them all. And I was not about to do that. So no post game for me. And the thing that brings it down is just the grinding aspect. I wasn't expecting to have to level grind in this game, but we actually did. Right before the final area, I had to go back into Mount Battle and just spend like 2 or 3 hours level grinding my Pokemon, which granted is a lot more efficient than just random encounter level grinding in a normal Pokemon game, but still not ideal. But it actually got pretty challenging at times. Those final 2 bosses were clutch. I honestly recommend watching the VOD if you haven't, but spoilers, we won first try, but we definitely shouldn't have. I honestly think I just got lucky with RNG because winning that final battle was so against my odds. But I really enjoyed it and I loved that my legendary beast trio was in there. I got to use my like 2 favorite Pokemon, a Suicune and an Umbreon. It was fantastic. Next is Quake 4, which I really freaking enjoyed. This is a 9 out of 10. I played it on easy because I'd played Quake 1 and 2 on easy, so I just wanted to keep the experience consistent, but I do definitely want to go back and play this game on normal at some point. It was a little bit too easy in some sections, but I think that kind of helps with the fun aspect, because you can kind of just go into a section guns a-blazing and just shoot anything that moves, and it's brilliant. It also is made in the same engine as Doom 3, and Doom 3 is one of my favorite games. I love that game. So I think it was a little bit of possible fan nostalgia and fan bias, but I just thought this was such a fun freaking game. I could not tell you what the story was about. Once again, Quake and Doom, they've never been about story. It is about getting cool guns and shooting really cool looking monsters and having really extravagant boss fights. And that's exactly what this game was. It is so good. We are going to skip ahead a tad past the Resident Evils. We'll come back to those because there's a few. Soma was another fantastic game that we played today. Soma is an 8 out of 10, which I was not expecting. It's made by the people who did the Amnesia games, and if you watched my ranking video last year, you would know that I have a bit of a bitter relationship with the Amnesia games. I did not love The Dark Descent. I really wanted to, but I just didn't. Whereas Soma, I really enjoyed. The puzzles were nowhere near as difficult. Soma really, I think, took advantage of that linear playstyle. It is very much a walking simulator. There is not many puzzles or stealth sections at all. There's really not that many enemies to avoid. It is just narrative. But it was so good. It had such a fantastic story. It really made me appreciate the concept of like AI and humanity in stories. I've never been super big into it, but I really enjoyed it. I love a game that gives me an existential crisis, and the entire night after playing this, I was going through it. I just love the way these games make me think and how they make you feel, and the ending was a gut punch. If you love existential, psychological horror, you like anything to do with AI and the concept of humanity, what makes a human, and you don't mind a walking simulator, please play Soma if you haven't already. This game needs to be talked about more, honestly. Next is the Stanley Parable, which was a bit of a wild card for us. It's not necessarily a horror game, but it finally got a physical release to console after all these years, so I picked it up. I picked up the Ultra Deluxe version, and I think it's a good game. It's probably not my style of game. It's not something I would normally pick up. But again, I wanted to play it just because of that like slight existentialism that it gives you. I did enjoy just mucking around with it for a day and seeing what sort of endings we could get. We did get quite a few of the endings. This is another game that very much encourages you to think outside of the box, interact with as many things as you can for as long as you can, and just see what outcomes happen. And I think that is super fun, but I don't think it's a game I would spend more than a day with. Like, we had one stream with it, and I don't think I would go back to it. But it's definitely fun to get to experience. I love the humor in it. I love games that like break the fourth wall and are very self-aware of themselves, and that's exactly what this game is. So I thought that was fun. Speaking of the Amnesia games, we played A Machine for Pigs this year, which is of course the second Amnesia game after A Dark Descent. And I'm actually ranking Machine for Pigs the same as A Dark Descent. It is our first 5 out of 10 this year. I still have no idea what the story's about. I don't read a lot of the notes in the Amnesia games, to be fair, so that's definitely on me. The story is just very convoluted and very difficult to follow, so I have no idea what was going on. All I know is I think stolen children were getting turned into pigs. Don't ask. I did really like the atmosphere and the horror elements of this game. I liked the aesthetic of it. And I did think the puzzles, although a little difficult, were a tad easier, so I enjoyed it over The Dark Descent for the puzzles and the gameplay. But what knocks it back down to A Dark Descent's level is the enemies. I'm not sure if they're just programmed this way or if my game was just glitchy, but they don't seem to actually be a threat. I encountered an enemy twice, and obviously Amnesia games, you can't fight, you're supposed to just like run and hide. I didn't need to. One enemy, I walked into a room and it despawned, which I did actually look up, and apparently that part's scripted, so whatever. And then the second time, I actually did run into an enemy, like it touched me, so I was ready to die, but nothing happened. I took no damage and it just disappeared from under my feet. And I did not have the story mode turned on. Like, I double checked my settings and enemies were supposed to be able to hurt me, but they just didn't. I, again, don't know if my game glitched or if that's how the game's supposed to be, but I think that really takes away from the tension. It got to the point where I didn't feel like I needed to stealth around these enemies. I was just running everywhere because they weren't a threat to me, which definitely took away from the atmosphere. Amnesia Rebirth, however, I enjoyed a little bit more. This is another 6 out of 10, which, again, a hot take. This whole list is just filled with hot takes, I feel like, because some people really hate Rebirth, but I know that other people, like me, it's their favorite of the Amnesia trilogy. And that is how I felt. I was actually able to follow along with the story this time for the most part. It's definitely still a little funky, especially near the end. Most of it's delivered in dialogue and cutscenes versus having to find notes around the environment, so it's a lot more in your face about here's what the story's about, so easier to follow. Again, also very linear, which I love. I have absolutely nothing against a straightforward walking simulator, and the few puzzles that there were, I also found fairly intuitive. There was only, I think, like 1 or 2 that I had to look up the solutions to, but for the most part, I was able to do it myself, which was really nice. There weren't really many enemies in this game, actually. I can remember about 2 sections where I had either a chase sequence or I had to stealth around an enemy, and that was about it. It was very much focused on the story. Still not, I think, a fantastic game. I'm still not 100% sure if the Amnesia games are particularly my style, but if we compare the trilogy, Dark Descent, Machine for Pigs, Rebirth is definitely my favorite. Oh, System Shock. Oh, my sweet, sweet System Shock. I have trauma from playing this game, dude. 5 out of 10. Which I know is gonna ruffle some people's feathers. Some people really love System Shock. To clarify, this is the remake for PS5 that we played. It's not the original. But from what I can gather, it's extremely similar to the original, almost identical from what I've heard. I haven't played it myself though, so I can't compare directly, but apparently it is quite faithful. Which I think makes sense. It definitely feels like a 90s PC shooter, because this game is grueling. I died over 100 times in my course of this game, and it was actually a game I wasn't sure if I was going to finish. We got about halfway through and I was just really not having a good time. I was so incredibly lost. I didn't know what to do. I was dying constantly. I couldn't work out any of the puzzles. I didn't know where I was supposed to go. I was like missing items. My inventory was full just all the time. I had like no health for a good few chapters. They do not give you health items very often. And it was a really tough game. I am glad that I stuck it out until the end. And I'm very proud to say that I did finish the game. I did beat it, but never, ever again. If you like this style of game, I highly recommend it. This is another one where I started on normal and an hour or so in actually had to restart the game to pick easy. The enemies will just chew through your health in like 2 or 3 hits. I genuinely went chapters. There's like 8 floors to the building. I genuinely went a few floors without finding any health items at all. And actually about halfway through a game, I found out we'd missed an item at the start of the game that you physically cannot finish the game without, simply because the game does not tell you. It just expects you to find these items on your own or suffer. There's like no indication of really what you're supposed to be actually looking for as you work your way through these floors. So thank God I was watching like a review video on the game and the person pointed that out, or I would have gotten to the end and just been stuck. I do have to speak some positives on the game though. I think the cyberspace sections were really fun where you're like inside the computer, and the final boss fight was actually pretty cool as well. I did enjoy that. And Shodan is a great antagonist. I do definitely feel threatened by all-powerful sentient AI. But yeah, never ever again. One that I do recommend people play though is Still Wakes the Deep. Now, this is actually made by the people who made Amnesia Machine for Pigs, the Chinese room. They helped develop Still Wakes the Deep. So it follows kind of a similar gameplay style. It is very linear in where you're going. It's kind of just walking, solving a puzzle, continuing on, but it's a lot more narrative based. There's some stealth sections, there's some puzzles, there's a lot of characters to follow, and there's a super great story. The game is also super cheap, so for what it is, 7 out of 10. If you can pick this one up, I highly recommend it. It also has some Lovecraftian vibes to it as well, so if that's your sort of thing, super cool. This is another one that has an absolutely gut punch ending. I was holding back tears during the final credits, but this game is incredible. I love the story. I love the setting, stuck out on an oil rig in like the middle of the ocean. The monsters are disgusting and terrifying. And again, I didn't really get stuck on any puzzles, which is nice. It's a very linear game, which I do enjoy. You go back to the same sections a couple times, so you actually start to learn your way around these areas, which is nice. And I cannot speak highly enough on the story. My complaint with this game, though, comes from the bugginess, which I can't entirely fault. It's a $50 game. It's made by some very small studios. I don't know if I'd exactly call it indie, but it is by no means a AAA game. And that does show. There's a lot of clipping. Enemies clip through walls. The character control's very slippery. I fell off of surfaces quite a lot, just because I guess I was too close to the edge and my character decided to just slide off. And this was actually a game my boyfriend also played, and we encountered an issue with his playthrough, not in mine, thankfully, that almost soft-locked the game. We slipped off of a surface and ended up in an area we weren't supposed to be in yet. We hadn't completed the current objective, but we couldn't move on to the next one because we hadn't completed the previous one. But reloading the checkpoint put you back in the area you weren't supposed to be, so we almost had to finish the game then and there, but luckily we were able to get past it. Next, we have a couple Silent Hill games. First, we're going to talk about The Short Message, which is a free demo that they released onto the PlayStation Store earlier in the year, kind of as like a tech showcase for what they could do with the engine they were making Silent Hill 2 Remake in. It's a 6 out of 10. It's very short. It's like 2 hours long. Again, I don't believe it's canon or really in the Silent Hill universe. It was basically just to showcase like the lighting engine and that sort of thing. So the story and the characters are quite shallow. It's about like social media and stuff. It's a little edgy. It's very on the nose. It's definitely not as in-depth as the mainline games by any means. So it is a little bit shallow in that aspect. It's again very short, and the enemy encounters were comprised of chase sequences, which I do not love, especially when they are trial and error focused like these ones were, just finding the right path through a maze while you're being chased by an enemy. So I didn't love it, but again, it was free, so I feel like I can't complain too much, and it definitely looked great. Silent Hill 1, however, is much, much better. I've played Silent Hill 2 and 3 before. I believe Silent Hill 2 I gave a 9. It is one of my favorite games. And Silent Hill 3 I actually gave an 8 as well. So 1 and 3 are ranked the same for me. But I finally went back and played the original for, again, our Retrovember event. And I love it. Nothing personally will stand up to Silent Hill 2 for me. I just think that the story of that one is so impactful. It's, again, one of those games that had me thinking about it for days on end. It, like, sent me into a spiral. I do enjoy, however, the, like, cult story of Silent Hill 1 and 3. I'm always quite intrigued by games that have some sort of religious undertone in that manner, or, like, cults and that sort of thing. They definitely do intrigue me. The story in those ones is definitely very uncomfortable. There's some very confronting topics. Alessia, that poor sweet girl, oh my goodness. I did know the story coming into this game, so that was not new for me. I'd seen playthroughs, I've obviously watched lore videos, and I'd played the third game already as well, so I knew what was to come. But the gameplay itself was completely new to me. I think the monsters were fantastic. I really enjoyed the monsters in this one. The air screamers and the dogs that chase you around were actually kind of hard to outrun. They got in the way a little bit. Of course, I loved the layout, exploring the town, going to the amusement park for a little bit. And I thought the characters were really nice. I love Lisa. I love Sybil. My biggest praise for this game is that out of Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3, Silent Hill 1 made me, I think, the most uncomfortable. I think it was a combination of the atmosphere, the camera angles, and the sound design, but I was so on edge at all times, and certain areas of this game just made me, like, so anxious to be in, which I think, considering how bad this game looks all these years later, is actually quite an impressive feat to be able to make me that uncomfortable and on edge. My complaint, though, is just how Harry controls, which, again, I do have to compare this to Resident Evil. It came out after Resident Evil 1 had already released. Jill and Chris control so much better than Harry Mason does. Harry was really, really slippery. It almost felt like when you would press the run input, it'd take him a few steps to actually get into a run. But then when you stop pressing the run input, he sort of slides for a few extra steps before he actually stops moving. And that, on top of his wide-ass turning circle, made maneuvering, especially in the tight alleyways, quite difficult. We got stuck on objects a few times. But I still loved the game. We did unfortunately get, like, the worst possible ending, which is very unfortunate. So I do plan on going back one day and trying to get a better ending. Next, you've probably been staring at them and you want me to talk about them, as we have The Last of Us. Now, this photo is for the PS5 remaster. I actually played the PS4 remaster version, which is mainly where my complaints come from. Everyone knows this is a fantastic game. I gave it a 9 out of 10. It was very, very close to a 10 out of 10 game, and I have a few thoughts on it. I had tried playing the game many, many years back, and I got about half an hour in and I decided the game wasn't for me. But I wasn't used to these sort of games back then, and so a few years later, where we are now, having gotten into more of this style of game, I wanted to give it another shot. The TV show had come out and I had watched season 1 of the TV show and really, really enjoyed it. And I knew how accurate it was to the game as well, so I decided it was finally time to take the plunge and play the game. I would have loved to play the PS5 remake, but unfortunately that game is $125 in Australia, and the PS4 version is a free download on the PS5 if you have PlayStation Plus. So I opted for the free version versus the $125 version, but I don't necessarily think that was a bad thing. I still had a really good time with this game, even knowing what happens, having seen the TV show, having seen bits and pieces of gameplay over the years, having heard the story from people, knowing what happens does not make this game any easier to get through. There were still tears being choked back in quite a few sections. This game is heavy. This game hits very hard, but that is what makes it so good. You actually feel attached to these characters and attached to the story, and the storytelling is just so masterfully done. The gameplay is challenging, but it never got frustrating for me. Most of the deaths I had felt like a fault on my part, which is how it should be, and they felt like something I could learn and improve from. What knocks it down from 10 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10 is unfortunately that PS4 version. It still, do not get me wrong, looks fantastic. It's still an incredible game, and it was free, so again, I can't complain that much. There were, of course, the occasional clipping and lighting engine bugs, but I don't really pay attention to that. We did unfortunately have a glitch about halfway through the game though, where my camera would just violently spin in circles, and there was nothing I could do about it. I either had to reload the game from a checkpoint, or I had to die and respawn for it to stop, and that happened 2 or 3 times. So that was a bit of a vibe killer, unfortunately. But I did see that they have added the PS5 version to PlayStation Plus now as well, so I definitely want to go through and give that one a shot one day to see how it compares, and I would also love to do a New Game Plus run of this as well. I genuinely really enjoyed it. And the benefit of getting the PS4 version is that it came free with the Left Behind DLC. Which again, I knew about this and I knew what happened because of the TV show and I've seen gameplay and stuff, but again, it does not hit any less hard. It gets ranked ever so slightly below the main game at an 8 out of 10 purely because of its length. It's very short. I think it was an hour and a half long for me. But the switching backwards and forwards between present day and the past day, I think was really well done. Sometimes that doesn't work very well in games, but for this one, I definitely think it helped. This was also pretty challenging. There was one section we did actually get stuck on for a few tries. And honestly, I don't know if going into this knowing the story made it better or worse, because I spent this whole time just knowing what was coming and knowing what was about to happen, and it filled me with so much dread. But I know lots of people never actually touched this DLC, so if you enjoyed the main game and you do have access to the DLC, please play it. I think it's great. Next, we have the Alan Wake games. So let's go ahead and start with the base game. Now, this one is the PS5 remaster version. And Alan Wake, for me, is a 7 out of 10. This is another one I had owned in my library for years and years, and I just never played it because I didn't think it was the kind of game for me. And then as my taste has evolved over the years, I decided that I did want to try it. And I'm very glad I did. The story of this one is really cool. We love a good psychological horror. But the gameplay, again, can you guess, was really freaking difficult for me. We played on normal. I would have loved to have played on easy. I picked normal and I couldn't change my decision. So I just had to suffer. I really like the mechanic of using the flashlight, and using the light to weaken shields before you can attack the enemies. I really like that gameplay aspect. Took a while to get used to though. I'm very much used to the third person over the shoulder style controls, but there's no generic crosshair, it's just the flashlight beam, but it felt off-center. I think it actually is off-center, you are very far skewed to the side, and it is very much a diagonal line rather than a straight line, so it actually took quite a while for me to get used to aiming. The whole game just feels like it's running on a diagonal. You're never aiming straight. Alan's never really walking straight, so that took a bit to get used to. But the thing that bothered me, and I will be the first to admit this could just be a skill issue, but it felt like this game had a problem with stun locking. The dodge mechanic felt really unreliable. I feel like sometimes it just straight up didn't work properly for me. And unfortunately, with the stun locking, there were many times I would get hit once and then just get hit a second time, a third time, before I could even press a button input, before the game would even let Alan fully stand back up for me to be able to run away or dodge or raise my gun, and you would just get pummeled into the ground. And especially when there's multiple enemies, you can just get like stuck between like 2 or 3 enemies, and you straight up cannot do anything about it. Sometimes you just cannot press any inputs because you're stuck in an animation of getting hit, and that was really frustrating. So that unfortunately is what lowers the score for me. We also played the 2 DLCs. The Signal is the first DLC and the Writer is the second. Both of these are super short. They're about an hour and a half each, so we actually played both the DLCs in a single stream. For me, the Signal goes down a peg to 6 out of 10, and that is purely because of its difficulty. It was so much harder than the base game. We had a bit of a rage fest with this DLC. There was one section in particular, 1 or 2 sections, that were just so stupidly hard. The Writer, however, was a tad bit easier again, so it goes back up to a 7 alongside its base game. I don't think the Writer by any means is as good as the base game. It is still just a DLC and it is very short, but I at least preferred it to the Signal. It wasn't as difficult, and I think I enjoyed the story of it to the Signal just a little bit as well. Next is Alone in the Dark. This is the PS5 remake that came out in, I want to say it was March. And this is a game I was super excited for because I had never played any of the Alone in the Dark games. However, they'd always been on my radar. I know how influential they are for the survival horror genre, and they inspired games I love like Resident Evil. So I was really excited to see that they were doing a reimagining of the first game. And this game got delayed, I believe, 2 times in its production, which I was a bit bummed about, but I'm always one to say I would rather wait longer for a good game than get a bad game early. So I was happy to wait for the delays, but unfortunately, even when it released, I do not think it was in a very good state. It's going right in the middle here at a 6 out of 10, and that really bums me to say, because again, I was so excited for this game. The positives are that I really like the story. I love the gameplay. Again, that like hub system of being in the house, but just slowly being able to unlock more and more rooms as you progress. I really love that. The puzzles were also really cool. I didn't find them too difficult, but they definitely required some thinking and they were challenging, but they felt really good to be able to complete. They were super fun. And I liked all the different characters in the house. I liked the interactions you have with them. I like that you get to pick the 2 playable characters to play between. But unfortunately, this game was just so buggy. I don't know if maybe the PC version or the Xbox version were any better. We played the PS5 version, but I really think it should have been delayed more. This game released at a full $100, and I unfortunately cannot recommend it at that price point. It may have had patches and bug fixes since it released. I haven't actually checked. But if we're talking about March of 2024, I cannot recommend it for its full price. And again, I know it's from a slightly smaller team. It is, again, not a AAA game. But especially for how many times it got pushed back, I expected it to be in a better state. There were lighting issues. There was a lot of clipping. I got stuck on objects a lot. During cutscenes, lots of times people's hair or objects in the background would be flickering or even vibrating, which of course takes from the immersion. All of those are just visual though, but unfortunately there were actually some gameplay glitches that hindered my ability to play the game. We played as Emily first, and we actually only got visual bugs during her playthrough, which was nice. But then when we played as Edward, we had a lot more trouble, and I don't know if that's because of Edward's campaign specifically, or if that was just a coincidence on how it happened. But there were a few times where we got stuck in objects to the point we couldn't move. There were also a few times enemies would get stuck in walls, which would mean you have to reload a checkpoint. And so a lot of the scripted enemy encounters would get stuck. There were bugs with our melee weapons where it wouldn't let us pick up new weapons, it wouldn't let us use the one we had equipped, and we again had to reload checkpoints. And then there were some issues later in the game in some of the boss fights, where instead of dialogue, people speaking, monster noises, that sort of stuff, every sound was just replaced by a sound effect of a phone ringing, which is a little strange. I don't know what happened there, but it was horribly annoying and wouldn't stop until you reloaded a checkpoint. But even then, I think we had to reload checkpoints like 4 or 5 times. And we even at one point had the game just straight up crash. Which again, all of that really bums me out because this game I was so excited for, and I really love the story and the gameplay. And I loved how the two characters' paths branch as well. The first half of each character's campaign is almost identical, but then the second half branches completely to the point where they go to different areas. They even have different final boss fights. And I love when that sort of thing happens. And again, the puzzles were so good, but it was just so buggy. So unless that sort of stuff's been fixed, or you can get this on like a half price sale, I don't know that I could recommend it. And finally, we come to the Resident Evil games. We have been playing through all of these guys over the course of the last couple years. And we still have quite a few games in the series to play, but we got through quite a few, as you can see. So we're going to start with the spin-off games, and we're going to start with Survivor. Survivor, for me, I did actually find quite fun. I gave it a 5 out of 10. It's very short. It's only about 3 hours long. We finished the game in one stream, but it's a first-person spin-off, which is cool. It takes a little bit to get used to control. Having tank controls in first person is actually a little weird, but it's kind of supposed to take place alongside the original outbreak of Raccoon City, which is kind of cool. I believe it's actually canon. And I thought it was just a super fun spin-off. It had the classic survival horror style gameplay, it had some puzzles in there, a little bit of exploration, but I actually really enjoyed it for what it is. Survivor 2, however, gets our first and only 4 out of 10 for this year. Survivor 2 is again a first-person spin-off, but it's an arcade style. So it is intended to be played with like light guns, which obviously I wasn't able to do. Controlling it with an analog controller isn't terrible, but it does feel a little janky. And this is the PAL version specifically, which apparently is the only version of this game that has this issue. But it was really, really laggy. It felt like the audio and the visual frames weren't lined up properly, and just walking around and trying to turn the camera and shoot, I think we probably would have been running at about 10 frames per second. It was really harsh. And being an arcade game as well, it's just not super fleshed out. It's supposed to be like a tiny abridged retelling of the story of Code Veronica, but then it's also got Nemesis chasing you for some reason. It's got like 5 or 6 levels you have to work your way through, and you've only got 3 lives. So if you lose your 3 lives, you start all the way back from level 1. But if you can manage to get through them all without any deaths, it's maybe an hour long. Each mission's like 5 to 10 minutes. And then next is Resident Evil Dead Aim, which is technically Survivor 4. It's hard to explain, but this guy goes alongside Survivor 1 for me. It's a tad bit longer. I think it was 4 or 5 hours long, and it's a mix of third person and first person. So you move around the map with your classic third person tank controls, but when you enter combat, it switches to first person, which I actually kind of liked. The characters are a little funky, and the game didn't look fantastic. The character models especially were really weirdly done. But it at least tries to have a narrative and to flesh out somewhat of a story. It also tries to be canon. Whether it actually is or not is up for debate. But it's just so full on. Really fun game. But there's like 10-20 zombies per room you go in. Like, they are absolutely everywhere, and they are fast. Next is the Outbreak games, and both of these take the title for the lowest rated game I have played thus far at a 3 out of 10. These are also the 2 Resident Evil games I can say I haven't finished. We played a mission or two of each, and unfortunately, I decided I was not going to get through them. I do plan on at some point in the distant future going back to these and actually trying to finish them in their entirety. But for now, it's just not happening. They are, again, spin-off titles, and they are supposed to be multiplayer. You get to pick a character out of like 5, and then I think it's you and 2 other characters do the level together, which me playing by myself means the other 2 characters were CPU, but the goal is that you are supposed to have other people play with you, which I think is definitely how this game was intended. You can tell that it's just not optimized for single player at all. Having to fight these CPUs for like healing items and key items and stuff that you need is really frustrating, especially when you only have 4 inventory slots. If your CPUs die as well, they're like dead. You can't go save them, so you better hope they didn't have any important items on them. But the thing that bothered me with these games is the infection meter. So they introduced a mechanic where over time, as the level goes on, you have an infection meter that slowly goes up. And if you get like bit by a zombie or injured, it goes up a little bit faster, with the goal that if that infection meter reaches 100%, you turn into a zombie, which means in multiplayer, you get to start fighting your friends, which is a cool concept. But what it means in single player is that it's an instant game over. So essentially what that means is that every single level is put on a timer. It's also not super obvious a lot of the time where you're actually supposed to be going in the levels, which for someone like me who is dumb and gets lost very easily and likes to follow a walkthrough, that isn't really possible because, again, the levels are on a timer. Oh, and by the way, the pause button doesn't pause the game. So you can't really stop to like look at a walkthrough or work out where you're supposed to go because you're being rushed. There's also, in each 30 to 60 minute long mission, only 1 save point. And it's usually about halfway through. So if you die and have to restart from your save point, you lose like 30-40 minutes of progress at a time. So I think these are games I do want to go back to at some point in the future and actually try and finish with a guide and stuff, but I just couldn't at the moment. I did give both of them a shot though. I think Outbreak 2 I do prefer slightly more. It seems like they did try to add some quality of life improvements to the game, and the level I did play I think I enjoyed more than the level I played in Outbreak 1, but they both still have the same flaws. Next, getting back to the main games, Resident Evil 1 we played last year in 2023. And that game I think I actually gave a 7 or a 6. I did really enjoy it, but for whatever reason I couldn't really get into it. I'm not sure if it's because I already knew so much about the game or I'd already seen so much gameplay of it, or maybe I just wasn't used to those sort of games at one point. As much as I enjoyed it, I couldn't get myself to rank it any higher. We continued on with the PS1 trilogy, and I can safely say I preferred these ones much more. Resident Evil 2 actually takes our place for 10 out of 10. Now, this may be a tad bit of bias. Resident Evil 2 Remake not only happens to be the first Resident Evil game I ever played, but is still to this day my favorite. But that is now alongside the original. I am not sure which I prefer more out of the two, the original or the remake, but I can safely say that this game is incredible. I think between the two, it just comes down to sometimes the original does things better than the remake, and sometimes the remake does things better than the original. I think that the remake has better puzzles. The original, they're very, very simplified, like the chess puzzle, for example. In the remake, not only do you have to find the pieces, you have to solve a riddle to be able to put them in the right spots. Whereas in the original, all you have to do is find the pieces, and that's it. There's no puzzle. Whereas in the original, I think the differences between the A and the B run are a lot better than they're done in the remake. They actually feel like they're happening simultaneously on top of each other, rather than them just feeling like the same campaign with different characters. And the zapping system is actually also really cool, being able to leave items in one playthrough for your B character to be able to access the next time around, and having some doors locked and unlocked is really cool. But then I think in the remake, the side characters' missions are a lot better than in the original, like playing as Sherry and Ada. So Resident Evil 2 I can still say is my favorite Resident Evil game, but this time the original is tied. And then next is Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which I was actually shocked to put at a 9 out of 10. I, again, have played the remake, and I liked the remake, but I definitely could tell that it was a very, very short game. My first playthrough was maybe 4 or 5 hours long, which is short for even a Resident Evil game. But I'd never played the original, so I wasn't 100% sure what people were talking about when they meant how different it was. But now going back, I can definitely see what they meant. I think when it comes down to it, I do prefer the original RE3 to the remake. But I almost feel like it's unfair to compare them because this is such a different game. Other than the fact you play as Jill and you're in Raccoon City, nothing else feels the same. There's completely different areas. There's like 2 whole areas in the original that aren't even in the remake. But then there's a section in the remake that's not really in the original. The puzzles are almost completely different. There's choices you can make in the original, which I don't know how much that actually impacts the game, but that's not in the remake. I think I do prefer the remake's interpretation of the characters. I prefer Jill and Carlos in the remake to in the original. But gameplay-wise, I think the original definitely wins. And that brings us to our final game of the year, Resident Evil 1 Remake. Now, this one I preferred so much more to the original RE1. It gets an 8 out of 10 from me. It feels a little weird putting it below RE3. I almost want to bump it up and put them together, but again, I need to stick to my original rankings. But 1 Remake is definitely a much better game than the original. I understand what people mean when they say that. I played it fairly recently after I played the original, like only a couple months apart, so going into it, a lot of it actually felt familiar, which I think may have helped. I didn't get entirely as lost because I already kind of knew my way around the mansion. I kind of knew what my objectives were, but they added in so many new areas and so many new puzzles to the remake that it also felt completely different. I didn't struggle a lot. I did have to look up some guides here and there, but more so for clarification purposes than actually walkthrough purposes. It really feels like peak survival horror is in this game right here. The story's still kind of cheesy and goofy, but it's been toned down a little bit. The characters control super well. I love how they've mixed up the gameplay from the original with all the new areas, the new puzzles, some new mechanics as well. I really had a good game. The only reason I think it got knocked down for me is the Crimson Heads. That's not to say they're not good. I think they're a good inclusion and I think they're done well. I just really hate them. So that's a personal gripe. Crimson Heads suck. But there we go. That is my complete tier list of every game we played on stream in 2024. There's definitely some hot takes in here, but we also found some incredible games. There's actually quite a few in this list that I would love to go back to one day and either try for a different ending or maybe do a new game plus or even just play through on a different difficulty. And there's quite a few games in here as well that have DLCs or sequels that I now know I definitely want to check out. And even some of our lower ranking games, I'm still really glad that I played them and that I got to experience them. I don't think any of these games are bad necessarily. Again, lots of my pros and cons with these games are going to be very subjective and very personal. But other than maybe System Shock, I wouldn't say there's any games here that I actually regret playing. But again, please do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think of my rankings, what your thoughts are on these games, and tell me what your favorite game is that you played in 2024 as well. If you like this sort of content and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And also consider checking out my TikTok page as well, as like I said, I do these sort of reviews monthly at the end of every month, recapping the games I play. And I'll be sure to link some playlists in the description if you want to hear some more in-depth thoughts on some of these games, like the Dead Space and Dark Pictures. And my playthroughs of basically all of these games are available to watch somewhere on my channel here, so dig through the playlist and you'll find them. But thank you very much for watching. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and keep an eye out for the next time we do this as well. This is definitely going to become an annual thing, and I can't wait to see what games we have lined up for December and for 2025 as well. I have some absolute bangers in the back catalog that I'm so excited to get to, and hopefully I will catch you guys around to be able to experience them with you as well. But until next time, guys, happy holidays, stay safe, have a wonderful time zone, and goodbye.